Hey guys, tonight we begin with something ancient Greece perfected almost as much as philosophy, telling people what not to do. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's awake while we quietly observe that history doesn't repeat. It just keeps the same habits. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In Athens, grief is not something you simply feel, it's something you manage, carefully, publicly, and preferably at a volume that doesn't suggest you're trying to personally notify the entire afterlife. You've just lost someone. Naturally, you want to mourn. Maybe cry, maybe gather people, maybe express emotions like a normal human being. Unfortunately, ancient Greece would like a word. There are rules, very specific ones. Your funeral cannot turn into a large gathering. The number of attendees is limited. Your mourning period, also limited. And your emotional expression, especially if it involves loud wailing, is expected to stay within what can only be described as socially acceptable sorrow. Women, who traditionally lead mourning rituals, are expected to keep everything under control. No excessive screaming, no dramatic collapses in the street, no transforming grief into a live performance that echoes through 3 neighborhoods and possibly a nearby olive grove, which, given the situation, feels a bit strict. But here's the problem you've walked into. Before these laws existed, funerals had a habit of escalating in ways that strongly suggest humans have never needed modern social media to compete for attention. You're not just mourning, you're being observed. If your family gathers 20 people, another gathers 40. If your grief is quiet, someone else's is louder. If you mourn for a few days, someone else extends it just to make sure everyone understands how deeply they care, or at least how visible their grief is. And just like that, you're no longer processing loss. You're participating in an unofficial, emotionally exhausting competition. No one announces it, no one hands out trophies, but somehow everyone knows the scoring system. Number of attendees, volume of crying, duration of mourning, bonus points for dramatic timing. If your funeral feels too small, too quiet, too reasonable, people might quietly assume you didn't care enough, which is a remarkable expectation to place on someone who is already having one of the worst days of their life. So naturally things escalate. Louder cries, larger crowds, longer rituals. At some point you begin to suspect someone is treating grief like an Olympic sport, and they are training for it. This is where the lawmakers of Athens step in, collectively deciding that absolutely none of this is necessary. They don't remove grief. That would be unrealistic and frankly suspicious. Instead, they contain it. Attendance is restricted. Duration is controlled. Volume is kept somewhere below public announcement to the gods. Not because they lack empathy, but because they understand something deeply uncomfortable about you and everyone else around you. If emotion is left unchecked, it will eventually become performance, and performance invites comparison. So now you mourn within boundaries, quietly, respectfully, without needing to outdo the family next door, who were previously treating sorrow like a competitive event with questionable judging standards. It's not perfect, it's not entirely comforting, but it does remove one very specific burden. You no longer have to win at being sad, and in ancient Greece, that's probably the most generous policy you're going to get. In Athens, wealth is something you can absolutely have, as long as you don't behave like a walking advertisement for it. You're doing well. Maybe your business is thriving, your land is productive, or your family has done suspiciously well for several generations. Naturally, you might feel the urge to show it. Better clothing, more jewelry, maybe something that quietly says, "Yes, I am doing better than you. Ancient Greece would prefer you." Not do that. There are rules, not always written in the same way across every city-state, but very clearly understood. Excessive displays of luxury are frowned upon, restricted, and sometimes outright punished. Clothing that is too elaborate, jewelry that is too abundant, or anything that draws too much attention to your wealth can quickly become a problem, which feels slightly unfair. After all, if you have money, why not enjoy it? Because the Greeks understood something deeply inconvenient about human nature. People notice. And when people notice, they compare. And when they compare, things rarely improve. You walking through the city dressed like a well-funded statue doesn't just reflect your success. It reminds everyone else of their lack of it. And that quiet reminder builds something dangerous. Resentment. Not immediately, not dramatically. Just slowly, quietly, like a tension that sits in the background of daily life. Too much visible wealth creates division. It draws lines. It turns neighbours into observers, observers into critics, and critics into people who are very interested in seeing you fail. So instead of letting society drift into quiet hostility, the Greeks do something practical. They limit the display. You can be wealthy, but you're expected to be discreet about it. Dress well, but not excessively. Wear jewellery, but not enough to reflect sunlight into someone else's eyes. Live comfortably, but avoid turning your existence into a public statement. It's less about equality and more about stability, because if no one looks dramatically richer than everyone else, then fewer people feel dramatically poorer. Of course, this doesn't eliminate wealth. It just makes it less obvious, which means everyone quietly suspects who the rich people are. They're just not entirely sure. And that uncertainty, strangely enough, keeps things calmer. So you adjust. You dress a little simpler. You leave a few accessories at home. You walk through the city looking appropriately successful, but not aggressively so. Because in ancient Greece, being rich isn't the problem. Being obvious about it is. In Athens, democracy gives you a voice. It lets you vote, debate, argue, and occasionally pretend you understand what's happening. It also gives your fellow citizens the ability to collectively decide that they would prefer you not be around for the next 10 years. Welcome to ostracism. You're going about your life. Maybe you're successful, maybe influential, maybe you speak a little too well in public, and people are starting to listen a little too closely. In most places, that's called ambition. In Athens, it's called something to keep an eye on. Once a year, the city gathers and holds a vote, not a trial, not a formal accusation, just a question floating quietly in the air. Is there someone here who is becoming a problem? If enough people agree, they write a name on a shard of pottery, an ostracon. If your name appears often enough, congratulations. You've just been selected for a 10-year vacation that you didn't ask for. No prison, no execution. Your property remains intact, your reputation less so. You are simply required to leave, which feels slightly extreme considering no crime necessarily needs to be proven. But here's the logic. The Greeks had a deep, almost paranoid fear of tyranny. They had seen what happens when one person gathers too much power, too much influence, too much loyalty. By the time a tyrant fully emerges, it's already too late. So instead of reacting to the disaster, they prevent it. Early, if someone becomes too dominant, politically, socially, or even just in public opinion, the system removes them before things escalate. Not because they have done something terrible, but because they might. It's preemptive stability. From your perspective, it's inconvenient. One day you're respected. The next, you're packing your belongings while trying not to take it personally that thousands of people collectively decided you were becoming a bit much. And the most unsettling part? There's no real defense. You can't argue your case. You can't debate your way out of it. You can't stand in the assembly and say, I promise I won't become a tyrant. That tends to have the opposite effect. So you leave, quietly, for 10 years, and then, if everything goes well, you come back. Which means ostracism isn't punishment in the traditional sense. It's more like society gently escorting you out of the room before things get awkward. Because in ancient Greece, the worst threat wasn't a criminal. It was someone who might eventually become too powerful. And unfortunately, that someone could be you. In Athens, you are technically part of a democracy. You have a voice. You have the right to speak in the assembly. You have the opportunity to influence decisions that affect the entire city. What you do not have is the freedom to treat it like an open mic night. Public speaking is taken very seriously. There are expectations. Not always written as strict laws, but enforced through custom, reputation, and the very real risk of public humiliation. You don't just stand up and start talking because you feel like it. You wait your turn. You follow procedure. And most importantly, you are expected to say something worth hearing, which already places you ahead of most modern discussions. The assembly, known as the ecclesia, is where citizens gather to debate laws, policies, and decisions. It is loud, crowded, and full of opinions. Without structure, it would collapse into chaos within minutes, or seconds, depending on how confident people are feeling that day. So rules exist to keep things barely under control. You speak in turn. You stay on topic. You avoid rambling endlessly. Ideally, you also avoid insulting everyone in the room. Although this last rule is more of a suggestion than a guarantee, there is also an unspoken expectation that you know what you're talking about. If you stand up and deliver a speech that is poorly argued, confusing, or clearly uninformed, the reaction is not polite silence. It is laughter, interruption, and a very quick reminder that public embarrassment is still very much a social tool. Which means every time you consider speaking, you have to ask yourself a simple question. Is this worth it? Because once you step forward, there is no quiet exit. The Greeks valued rhetoric, the art of persuasion, almost as much as the ideas themselves. A strong argument could shift policy, influence war decisions, or change the direction of the city. A weak one could end your credibility faster than you can finish your sentence. And unlike modern systems, there is no comfortable distance between you and the audience. They are right there, listening, judging, reacting in real time, which creates a surprisingly effective filter. Only those confident or bold of enough step forward. And even then, not all of them survive the experience with their dignity intact. So you learn quickly. Speak clearly. Speak wisely. Or don't speak at all, because in ancient Greece, having the right to speak does not protect you from the consequences of doing it badly. And the audience is always ready. In Athens, democracy is not just a system you benefit from. It is something you are expected to participate in, actively, regularly, and ideally without pretending you are not really into politics. You are a citizen. That means you vote, you attend assemblies, you engage in public life, or at least you are supposed to. Because if you don't, the Greeks have a word for you. Idiots. It sounds familiar for a reason. Originally, it didn't mean you lacked intelligence. It meant you chose to stay out of public affairs. You focused only on your private life, your work, your family, your personal concerns, and ignored the wider functioning of the city. To modern ears, that sounds normal, even peaceful. To the Greeks, it was a problem because their entire system depended on participation. Democracy only works if citizens show up, listen, argue, and vote. If too many people step back and say, "This isn't my concern," then decisions fall into the hands of fewer and fewer voices, and those voices tend to become louder, more powerful, and occasionally problematic. So disengagement wasn't seen as neutrality, it was seen as neglect. From your perspective, this creates a slightly uncomfortable situation. You cannot simply decide that politics is exhausting and retreat into your personal life. The expectation is clear. If you benefit from the city, you contribute to it. You attend debates. You listen to speeches. You vote on decisions that may or may not make immediate sense to you. And you do this not because you enjoy it, although some people absolutely do, but because the system requires your presence to function. Ignoring it doesn't make you independent. It makes you unreliable. There is also a social cost. Being labelled an idiot isn't a casual remark. It carries the implication that you are disconnected from the collective, that you are not pulling your weight, that you are leaving responsibility to others while still enjoying the benefits of their decisions. Which, in Greek terms, is not a flattering position. So you participate, even when the debates are long, even when the arguments repeat themselves, even when you begin to suspect that half the people speaking are far more confident than they are correct. Because in ancient Greece, democracy is not a spectator sport. You are not watching it happen. You are part of it, whether you find that exciting or deeply exhausting. In Athens, relationships come with expectations, very clear ones, very serious ones, and if you decide to ignore them, the consequences are not subtle. You are married, or perhaps you are simply involved in someone else's household in a way that should remain strictly appropriate. Either way, there is a line you are not supposed to cross. If you do cross it, specifically if you are caught in an adulterous act with someone's wife, the law takes a rather direct approach. The husband has the legal right to kill you, immediately, on the spot. No trial, no extended debate. No opportunity to explain that it was all a misunderstanding involving poor timing and questionable judgment, which does create a strong incentive to not get caught, or more sensibly, not do it at all. At first, this feels extreme, dramatic, even by ancient standards. But the Greeks weren't acting randomly here. They were protecting something they considered absolutely essential, the integrity of the household. Family structure in ancient Greece wasn't just personal, it was political and economic. Property, inheritance, citizenship, and lineage all depended on knowing exactly who belonged to whom. If that certainty collapsed, so did a significant part of the social order. Adultery didn't just threaten a marriage, it threatened clarity. And without clarity, you get disputes. Disputes lead to conflict. Conflict leads to instability. And suddenly, something that started as a private decision becomes a public problem. So the law steps in, not with subtlety, but with finality. From your perspective, this creates a very clear set of priorities. You exercise caution. You avoid situations that could be interpreted badly. You develop a strong appreciation for doors that lock, and for not being behind them when you shouldn't be. There are also alternative penalties in some cases. Public humiliation, fines, or social consequences that ensure your reputation does not recover quickly. But the possibility of immediate, irreversible consequences tends to overshadow the rest. Interestingly, this severity isn't applied equally in all directions. Social expectations differ depending on status, gender, and context, which adds another layer of complexity that you are expected to understand without making mistakes. So you navigate carefully, because in ancient Greece, some laws are designed to guide behavior, and others are designed to make absolutely certain you think twice before ignoring them. This is very much one of the second kind. In Athens, citizenship is not something you casually acquire. It is not handed out for loyalty, long residence, or even obvious contribution to society. It is inherited, carefully, exclusively, and with a level of gatekeeping that would make modern bureaucracies feel almost welcoming. You want to be a citizen. That seems reasonable. After all, citizens get to vote, speak in assemblies, own certain rights, and generally participate in the very system that claims to represent the people. There's just one small detail. Both of your parents must already be citizens. Not one, both. Which means if your mother or your father is not Athenian, your chances of becoming a full citizen drop to zero, regardless of how long you've lived there, how much you've contributed, or how passionately you feel about civic duty. You could spend your entire life in Athens, work, trade, pay taxes, serve the city in various ways, and still remain outside the political system, which feels slightly unfair, and also very intentional, because this rule exists for one reason: control. Citizenship determines who has power, who votes, who shapes laws, who decides the direction of the city. And if that group expands too quickly or too loosely, control over the system becomes unpredictable. So the Greeks limit it, strictly. By tying citizenship to bloodline, they ensure that political power remains within a defined group, one that shares ancestry, culture, and, ideally, similar interests. From your perspective, this creates a very clear hierarchy. At the top, citizens fully involved in political life. Below them, residents, traders, foreigners, essential to the economy, but excluded from decision-making. And further down, those with even fewer rights. It's a system that functions efficiently, as long as you are in the right category. If you are not, your role is clear. You contribute. You participate economically. You follow the laws, but you do not shape them. There is also a deeper concern behind this rule. The Greeks feared external influence. The idea that outsiders might gain power and steer the city in directions that conflict with its traditions or stability. So instead of risking that, they close the door almost entirely, which means becoming a citizen is not about proving yourself. It's about being born correctly. So you learn your place quickly, because in ancient Greece, democracy exists. It's just carefully limited to a very specific group of people. In Athens, you are absolutely allowed to drink wine. In fact, it is expected, encouraged even. Wine is part of daily life, social gatherings, and intellectual discussion. What you are not allowed to do is drink it like you're trying to forget your own name by sunset. Because the Greeks don't just drink, they organise drinking. You are invited to a symposium, a formal gathering where wine, conversation and philosophy come together in what sounds like a pleasant evening, until you realise it is also carefully structured to prevent you from embarrassing yourself too quickly. First rule, the wine is diluted. Yes, diluted. Straight wine, what you might consider normal, is seen as excessive, even barbaric. The Greeks mix it with water, often at specific ratios, to ensure that the evening progresses slowly rather than collapsing into chaos within the first hour, which from your perspective feels slightly disappointing, but also practical. Second rule, there is a leader, a symposiarch. This person decides how strong the wine is, how quickly it is served, and how the evening unfolds. In other words, your drinking pace is not entirely your own. It is managed, monitored, and adjusted based on how the group is behaving. Think of it as social drinking, with supervision. Third rule, the goal is conversation, not collapse. You are expected to engage, to talk, to debate, to share ideas. Wine is there to loosen the mind, not erase it completely. If you reach the point where your contribution becomes less philosophical and more unintelligible, you have officially missed the point, and people will notice. Because unlike modern settings, where poor decisions can sometimes be forgotten, in ancient Greece, your behaviour becomes part of your reputation, and reputation matters. So you adjust, you drink slowly, you listen, you speak when you have something worth saying, you try to remain just coherent enough to appear thoughtful, but relaxed enough to seem interesting. It's a delicate balance. Of course, not every symposium ends perfectly. Some still drift into louder conversations, questionable decisions, and the occasional moment where dignity quietly exits the room. But the structure helps, because the Greeks understand something simple. Alcohol doesn't create chaos, it reveals it. So instead of banning drinking, they control it, shape it, guide it into something that ideally produces ideas, rather than regret. Which means that in ancient Greece, even your wine has rules, and ignoring them usually ends exactly how you would expect. In Athens, death is respected, honoured, carefully ritualised, but it is not conveniently located. You've lost someone. You want to bury them properly, perhaps somewhere close, somewhere meaningful, somewhere you can visit without planning a small journey. Ancient Greece would like to gently inform you that this is not an option. Burials within the city are restricted, often outright banned. The dead are placed outside the city walls, along roads or in designated areas, where they are respectfully, but very deliberately, kept at a distance from the living, which at first feels slightly inconvenient, possibly even insensitive. But once again, there is a reason, several actually. First, there is the matter of health. The Greeks may not fully understand bacteria in the modern sense, but they understand decay. Bodies decompose, decomposition smells, and when too many bodies are placed too close to where people live, the results are noticeable, very noticeable, and not in a poetic philosophical way. Keeping burials outside the city helps maintain basic hygiene, reduces unpleasant conditions, and ensures that daily life isn't constantly interrupted by reminders of mortality drifting through the air. Second, there is the matter of space. Cities like Athens are growing, crowded, and busy. Every piece of land is valuable. Homes, markets, temples, public spaces all compete for limited room. Allowing burials inside the city would slowly transform living space into something far less livable. And while honouring the dead is important, the Greeks are quite firm on one point. The living still needs somewhere to exist. Third, there is a cultural boundary. The Greeks draw a clear line between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Keeping graves outside the city reinforces that separation. It creates a physical reminder that life and death, while connected, are not meant to overlap too closely. From your perspective, this means adjusting your expectations. You prepare the body, you conduct the rituals, you accompany the procession, but ultimately you leave the deceased outside the walls. You visit when appropriate, not constantly. You remember, but you also return to daily life. It's structured, controlled, slightly distant, but effective, because in ancient Greece even death is organised. Not out of disrespect, but out of practicality, and perhaps a quiet understanding that while the dead deserve honour, The living still prefer clean air, open space, and a city that doesn't smell like a permanent reminder of what's coming for everyone eventually. In Athens, you are free to speak. You can debate, argue, criticize policies, question leaders. All the things a functioning democracy quietly depends on. What you are not free to do is casually destroy someone's reputation for entertainment. Public insults, slander, and false accusations are taken seriously. Not in the someone might be offended sense, but in the this could destabilize society sense, which feels like an overreaction, until you consider how much reputation matters here. In ancient Greece, your honor is not just personal. It is social currency. It determines how people treat you, whether they trust you, whether they listen to you, and whether you can participate effectively in public life. If that reputation is damaged, especially publicly, the consequences spread quickly. You might lose credibility, opportunities disappear, alliances weaken, and in a society where public perception shapes real outcomes, that damage is not easily repaired. Now imagine someone standing in a public space and making false accusations about you. Not quietly, not privately, loudly, confidently. In front of everyone, the damage is immediate, and if there are no consequences for that behavior, it becomes useful. People could manipulate public opinion, discredit rivals, and influence decisions not through truth, but through well-timed insults and carefully crafted lies. Which is a problem, a very familiar problem. So the Greeks do something surprisingly reasonable. They regulated certain forms of public insult, especially those that involve false claims or serious accusations, can lead to legal action. You can be fined, prosecuted, or otherwise held accountable for damaging someone's reputation without justification. From your perspective, this creates a new layer of caution. You can still speak. You can still criticize. You can still disagree, often loudly and passionately. But you have to be careful, because there is a difference between argument and accusation, and crossing that line has consequences. Of course, this doesn't eliminate insults entirely. People still argue, still mock each other, still say things they probably regret later. They're human. But the presence of legal boundaries means that you think twice before turning disagreement into defamation. Because in ancient Greece, words carry weight, not just emotionally, but legally. And if you use them carelessly, the cost isn't just embarrassment. It's something much more tangible, which means that in this society, speaking freely is a privilege. Speaking recklessly is a risk. In Athens, being a citizen comes with privileges. You can vote, speak, participate in public life, and occasionally feel very important during debates. It also comes with a requirement you cannot quietly ignore. When the city calls for war, you go. There is no comfortable distance between you and the battlefield. No professional army handling everything while you continue your daily routine. If you are a male citizen of the right age, you are expected to serve. Which means one day you are discussing policies in the assembly, and the next, you are standing in armour, holding a spear, hoping the person next to you knows what they're doing. Spoiler, they are probably hoping the same about you. This system is built around the idea of the citizen soldier, the hoplite. You fight not as an individual hero, but as part of a formation, a phalanx, shields locked together, movement coordinated, survival dependent on the person beside you doing their job, which creates a powerful incentive to not run away. Because if you break formation, you're not just endangering yourself, you're endangering everyone. From your perspective, this changes everything. War is no longer something distant. It's not a story you hear about. It's not a decision made by others that you simply observe. It's personal. If the city goes to war, you are directly involved in the outcome. Victory affects you. Defeat affects you. Decisions made in the assembly suddenly feel much more important when you realize you might be the one carrying them out. And that is exactly the point. The Greeks believed that those who make decisions about war should also bear the cost of those decisions. It creates accountability. It forces citizens to think carefully before voting for conflict, because they know they won't be watching it from a safe distance. Of course, this doesn't mean everyone is enthusiastic about it. Some people would very much prefer to stay home, but refusal to serve comes with consequences. Loss of honour, social shame, and in some cases, legal penalties. Because from the city's perspective, benefiting from its protection while refusing to defend it is not a reasonable position. So you prepare. You train, at least enough to stand in formation without causing immediate disaster. You maintain your equipment. You accept that, at some point, you may be called. Because in ancient Greece, citizenship is not just about rights, it's about responsibility. And sometimes, that responsibility involves standing in a line of armoured individuals, hoping that your collective coordination is slightly better than the group approaching you from the other direction. In Athens, the marketplace, the agora, looks like a lively, chaotic place. Stalls, voices, goods from across the Mediterranean, and a steady flow of people trying to buy, sell, or politely argue about prices. It feels like a free market. It is not. You want to open a shop, sell olive oil, wine, bread, maybe something slightly more ambitious. You find a spot, set up your goods, and prepare to do business. Ancient Greece would like to remind you that someone is watching. Markets are heavily regulated, not in a subtle, we'll trust you to behave way, but in a very direct, there are officials whose job is to make sure you don't get creative with honesty way. These officials, market inspectors, walk through the agora, checking weights, measuring goods, and making sure what you claim to sell is actually what you are selling, which immediately limits your options. You cannot quietly adjust your scales to make them slightly more favourable to you. You cannot sell diluted wine and hope no one notices. You cannot label something as high quality when it clearly isn't, or at least you can try, but the consequences are not pleasant. Fines, public punishment, and the rapid destruction of your reputation are all very real possibilities. And since reputation in ancient Greece is essentially your entire business model, losing it tends to end your career faster than any financial setback. From your perspective, this creates a very specific kind of pressure. You have to be honest. Consistently, not because you are naturally inclined toward fairness, but because the system makes dishonesty more trouble than it's worth. And that is exactly the goal. The Greeks understand that markets can easily become chaotic. Without oversight, prices fluctuate wildly, quality drops, and trust disappears. Once trust is gone, people hesitate to buy, trade slows down, and the entire system starts to weaken. So instead of letting that happen, they enforce structure. You sell what you claim. You measure accurately. You price reasonably. And you do all of this while knowing that at any moment, someone might check. It's not glamorous. It's not entirely relaxed. But it works. Because in ancient Greece, trade is not just about profit. It's about maintaining trust in a system where one dishonest seller could quietly ruin things for everyone. So you keep your scales accurate, not out of virtue, but out of self-preservation. In Athens, food is not just food. It is stability, survival, and on bad days, the difference between a functioning city and a very loud public crisis. You wake up, go to the market and buy grain, wheat or barley, the essentials. Bread is daily life. It's not optional, not a luxury, not something you casually ignore because you're not that hungry, which means the supply of grain is taken very seriously. You cannot hoard it freely. You cannot manipulate its price without consequences, and you definitely cannot waste it in a way that disrupts supply. Because what seems like a small personal decision quickly becomes a public problem. Grain traders are monitored, storage is watched, imports are regulated. In some cases, the state even steps in directly to control distribution, ensuring that food continues to reach the population at reasonable prices. Which, from your perspective, feels like a lot of oversight for something as simple as bread. But the Greeks are not being overly cautious. They are being realistic, because food shortages don't stay quiet. If grain becomes scarce, prices rise. When prices rise, people struggle. When people struggle, they complain, loudly. And when enough people complain at the same time, you no longer have a market issue. You have unrest. And unrest, in a city that prides itself on order and debate, is not something anyone wants to deal with. So instead of waiting for that chain reaction, the Greeks prevent it. They control the system early. You, as a trader or buyer, operate within those limits. You don't buy excessive amounts just to store them. You don't sell at absurd prices hoping to profit from scarcity. And if you try, there are consequences, fines, penalties, and a very fast decline in how others view you. Because in a society like this, exploiting food supply isn't just seen as greedy, it's seen as dangerous. From your perspective, this creates a kind of quiet discipline. You buy what you need. You sell fairly. You avoid drawing attention to yourself for the wrong reasons. And perhaps most importantly, you understand that your actions are not isolated. They ripple. One person hoards, another struggles. Enough people struggle, and suddenly the city feels it. So you adjust. Because in ancient Greece, grain is not just another product. It is the foundation of daily life. And treating it casually is not just irresponsible. It's an excellent way to make sure the entire city notices you, for all the wrong reasons. In Athens, you are allowed to own property. You can build a house, improve it, make it comfortable, maybe even a little impressive. What you cannot do is turn it into a personal monument to your own importance, because building too large, too elaborate, or too dominant within the city could attract attention, and not the kind you want. There are expectations, sometimes informal, sometimes enforced, that houses remain relatively modest compared to public buildings. Temples, civic spaces, and structures meant for the community are supposed to stand out. Your private home is not, which from your perspective feels like an unnecessary limitation. If you have the resources, why not build something bigger? Something better? Something that clearly shows your success? Because once again, the Greeks are thinking ahead. A house that is too large does more than provide comfort. It sends a message. It tells everyone who sees it that you have more wealth, more power, more influence than those around you. And as you might have noticed by now, they are not particularly fond of messages like that. Too much visibility creates tension. It invites comparison. It raises questions. And in some cases, it makes you look less like a successful citizen and more like someone positioning themselves above the rest, which is exactly the kind of perception that can lead to problems. From your perspective, this means adjusting your ambitions. You build a solid house, a comfortable one, something that reflects stability, not dominance. You avoid unnecessary excess. You keep things proportionate to the surrounding environment, because fitting in is safer than standing out too much. There is also a practical side to this. Cities like Athens are not endlessly spacious. Streets are narrow. Space is limited. If everyone starts expanding without restraint, the result is not impressive architecture. It's overcrowding, obstruction, and a city that becomes difficult to navigate. So limits, whether formal or social, help maintain balance. From your point of view, it's a quiet compromise. You sacrifice the ability to fully display your wealth in exchange for stability, acceptance, and a significantly lower chance of becoming the subject of unwanted attention. Because in ancient Greece, success is acceptable, but making sure everyone notices it is where the problems begin. In Athens, you are expected to honor the dead, properly, respectfully, with rituals that acknowledge their place in your life. What you are not expected to do is stay there indefinitely. You've already buried your loved one outside the city walls. You've followed the processions, performed the rites, expressed your grief, within the acceptable volume, of course. Naturally, you feel the urge to return, to visit often, to sit, to remember, to hold on to what was lost. Ancient Greece would prefer that you don't overdo it. There are limits, sometimes formal, often social, on how frequently you visit graves and how long mourning continues in visible ways. Regular visits are acceptable. Constant visits are not, which feels, again, slightly harsh. But the Greeks are not trying to erase memory. They are trying to prevent something else. Because grief left unchecked doesn't always fade. Sometimes it deepens. Sometimes it becomes something heavier, something that begins to pull you away from daily life. If you spend too much time with the dead, you slowly disconnect from the living. And from the city's perspective, that is a problem. You are part of a functioning society. You have responsibilities. Family, work, civic duties, all the things that keep the system moving. If too many people withdraw into prolonged mourning, the balance shifts, life slows, participation drops. So instead of letting grief quietly consume everything, the Greeks place boundaries around it. You mourn, you remember, but you return. From your perspective, this creates a strange tension. Part of you wants to stay, to revisit the past, to hold on to what is no longer there. The other part is constantly being pulled back into the present, into daily routines, obligations, conversations, responsibilities. And that is exactly the intention, because the Greeks believe something very simple and very firm. Life must continue, not eventually, not when you feel ready, but steadily. even when it's difficult. So you visit, but not endlessly. You remember, but not at the cost of everything else. And over time, the structure does something subtle. It doesn't remove grief. It doesn't erase loss. But it prevents it from becoming your entire existence, which, in its own restrained and slightly uncompromising way, is a kind of mercy. Because in ancient Greece, even memory has boundaries, not to diminish it, but to make sure the living don't disappear alongside the dead. In a quiet workshop in Florence, a man sits surrounded by scattered papers, ink-stained fingers, and half-finished sketches that seem to belong to a world not yet invented. His name is Leonardo da Vinci, and while history politely files him under painter, that label barely scratches the surface. Painting for Leonardo is almost a side hobby. His real work happens in the margins of notebooks, where imagination quietly ignores the laws of time. You would not immediately understand what you're looking at if you glanced over his shoulder. A spiral of blades that looks like a mechanical flower, a wooden frame shaped like wings, clearly not meant for a bird. Strange armoured shells mounted on wheels, as if a tortoise decided it had ambitions of conquest. None of it exists. Not yet. And yet, here it is, carefully measured, precisely drawn, almost annoyingly confident in its own possibility. Leonardo doesn't rush. He studies everything. The way birds tilt their wings mid-air, the way water curls around obstacles, the way muscles stretch beneath skin. Where others see ordinary life, he sees blueprints. Every movement becomes a lesson, every observation a quiet theft from nature's design. If the world refuses to build these machines, then fine. He will simply sketch them into existence and wait a few centuries for humanity to catch up. Of course, there is a small problem. The 15th century is not exactly famous for advanced engineering. You can design a flying machine all you like, but if your materials are wood, cloth, and optimism, you're not getting very far. Leonardo knows this. He just doesn't care enough to stop. His notebooks are not limited by what is possible. They are guided by what should be possible. And so he keeps drawing. Not for approval, not for fame, and certainly not for practicality. He draws because the ideas won't leave him alone. They pile up, page after page, quiet evidence of a mind that refuses to stay confined to its own era. Centuries later, people will flip through these pages and realize something uncomfortable. He wasn't guessing. He was early. Leonardo's fascination with flight begins, quite inconveniently, with birds, creatures that seem to mock every human limitation simply by existing. In the hills outside Florence, he watches them for hours, studying the subtle tilt of wings, the invisible currents they ride, the effortless way they turn air into something solid enough to stand on. To most people, this is a pleasant distraction. To Leonardo da Vinci, it is a problem waiting to be solved. He does not begin with wild guesses. He measures. He sketches. He dissects the mechanics of motion with the patience of someone who has clearly decided that gravity is more of a suggestion than a rule. Wings, he notes, are not just flapping ornaments. They are carefully structured tools. The bones, the joints, the angles, all of it matters. If a bird can do it, then logically a human could too. The only obstacle is everything else, and so the designs begin. One of his earliest concepts resembles what we would now call an ornithopter, a machine with large flapping wings powered by human effort. It looks impressive on paper, elegant even, but there is a quiet flaw hiding beneath its beauty. Human muscles are not built for flight. You can strap a man into wings all you like, but unless he has secretly been replaced by something far more durable, he is not going anywhere except briefly downward. Leonardo, to his credit, starts to realize this, slowly, reluctantly. Gravity continues to win every argument, so he adapts. Instead of fighting nature, he begins to study gliding, how birds coast through the air without constant effort. His designs shift. Wings become broader, more stable. The machines begin to resemble early gliders, crafted from wood and linen, designed to catch the wind rather than conquer it. For a moment it almost feels possible. Almost. But there is still the small issue of testing. There are no proper runways, no safety equipment, no reassuring voice saying, "This has been tried before." Just a hillside, a fragile machine, and a deeply questionable life choice. Whether any of these designs were ever fully tested remains uncertain. History is suspiciously quiet on the matter. which usually means things did not go well. Still, the idea refuses to die. Leonardo may not have flown, but he came dangerously close to understanding how it could be done. And in a century where most people were still trying to avoid falling off things, that alone was enough to make him seem slightly unhinged, or centuries ahead. Leonardo's next idea does not bother with wings at all. By now he has spent enough time watching birds to realize something mildly disappointing. Copying them exactly might not be the smartest approach. So, naturally, he does what any reasonable genius would do. He abandons imitation and invents something entirely new. Somewhere in his endless notebooks, Leonardo da Vinci sketches a device that looks less like a machine and more like a philosophical argument against gravity. It is a large, vertical screw, stretched upward like a coiled spiral, mounted on a central axis. At first glance, it resembles a giant drill, or a pastry gone terribly wrong. Either way, it is not subtle. The concept is surprisingly bold. Instead of flapping or gliding, this machine would spin. As it turns, the spiral surface would compress the air beneath it, pushing downward and, in theory, lifting the structure upward. In other words, Leonardo has just invented a primitive version of the helicopter, centuries before anyone had the materials or engines to make such a thing even remotely practical. The design itself is almost elegant in its simplicity. A wooden frame, a linen covering stiffened with starch, a team of men standing on a central platform, pushing bars to rotate the mechanism like a human-powered merry-go-round with ambitions. You can already sense the problem. Human power, once again, is doing its best and failing spectacularly. The machine, if built exactly as drawn, would almost certainly refuse to leave the ground. Air, as it turns out, is not easily persuaded by optimism alone. The spiral would struggle to generate enough lift, the structure would likely wobble, and the entire operation would end with several exhausted men questioning their life choices. And yet the idea itself is not wrong. That is the unsettling part. Leonardo understands something fundamental, that vertical flight is possible if you can push enough air downward with enough speed. He lacks the tools, the engine, and perhaps a slightly stronger sense of practicality. But the principle is there, quietly waiting for a future that can finally keep up. Centuries later, when real helicopters begin to rise into the sky, historians will look back at this peculiar spiral and realize that Leonardo was not experimenting randomly. He was circling around the truth, getting just close enough to prove that the impossible was merely delayed, not defeated. Just waiting. If Leonardo's flying machines aimed for the sky, his next invention turns its attention firmly back to the ground, preferably while crushing anything unfortunate enough to be in the way. War, after all, is a reliable source of funding, and Leonardo da Vinci is nothing if not adaptable when it comes to keeping powerful patrons interested. Somewhere between sketches of wings and spirals, he drafts something far less graceful, an armoured vehicle. At first glance, it resembles a large, sloped shell, part turtle, part nightmare, mounted on wheels. The exterior is reinforced, angled to deflect incoming attacks, while inside, a group of men operate a series of cranks that set the entire structure in motion. Around its circular edge, cannons protrude in every direction, ready to fire outward like a rotating storm of iron and smoke. In short, Leonardo has just sketched a tank, several centuries before anyone else thought to combine mobility, armour and firepower into one convenient package of chaos. The idea is, once again, unsettlingly sound. On paper, this machine would roll across the battlefield, protecting its operators while delivering continuous fire in all directions. Soldiers outside would struggle to penetrate its defences, while those inside would enjoy the rare medieval luxury of not immediately being stabbed. It is, by the standards of the time, an almost unfair advantage. Of course, there is a catch. There is always a catch. The internal mechanism, as drawn, contains a small but rather critical flaw. The gears are arranged in a way that would cause the wheels to turn against each other. Instead of moving forward like a confident instrument of war, the machine would likely sit in place, stubbornly refusing to cooperate, an expensive, heavily armed ornament. Historians still debate whether this was a mistake or something more deliberate. Some suspect that Leonardo, who was not particularly fond of war despite designing for it, may have intentionally sabotaged the plans. After all, Giving rulers a fully functional armoured war machine might not have been the most comforting contribution to humanity. Even so, the concept refuses to lose its significance. The idea of mobile armoured warfare will eventually define entire conflicts, from the muddy trenches of World War I to the mechanised battles that follow. And at the quiet beginning of that long, violent evolution sits Leonardo's rolling fortress, imperfect, impractical, and somehow still centuries ahead of its time. It does not need to work to be important. It only needs to exist on paper, patiently waiting for the future to fix its flaws. By now, Leonardo has explored the sky, experimented with vertical flight, and designed a rolling fortress that almost works. Naturally, the next logical step is to improve how efficiently one human can ruin another's day from a distance. War, once again, provides the motivation, and Leonardo da Vinci provides the imagination. Enter the multi-barreled weapon. At a time when reloading a single firearm is a slow, almost meditative process. Powder, ball, tamp, prey. Leonardo proposes something radically impatient. Instead of one barrel, why not have many? Mounted side by side, arranged in rows, capable of firing in sequence. Not quite the chaotic spray of modern weapons, but a calculated rhythm of destruction that dramatically reduces downtime. One of his designs resembles a fan or organ, with multiple small cannons aligned horizontally. Another variation arranges them in rotating sets, while one group fires, another cools, and a third reloads. It is less of a single weapon and more of a system, which, in Leonardo's world, is always where things start to get interesting. The idea is simple. Remove the delay, keep the pressure constant, make the battlefield less forgiving for anyone caught in the open. And once again, he is not wrong. In theory, such a device would allow a crew to maintain near-continuous fire, something unheard of in his time. Enemies expecting the usual pause between shots would instead face a steady, unsettling rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. Like a drum beat with very poor intentions. It would not just change combat tactics. It would reshape how soldiers move, hide, and survive. But as always, reality has its own opinions. The logistics are complicated. Aligning multiple barrels, coordinating ignition, managing recoil, preventing overheating. All of this requires a level of precision and material quality that the 15th century struggles to provide consistently. One misfire, one misalignment, and the entire elegant system becomes a very loud disappointment. Still, the principle lingers. Centuries later, the idea of increasing fire rate will evolve into something far more refined and far more devastating. Early machine guns, volley guns, and repeating firearms will carry echoes of Leonardo's original frustration with slow reloading. He did not invent the final form, but he understood the problem long before others fully recognized it, which, by now, is becoming a pattern. Leonardo does not always build the future. He sketches its outline, leaves the details for later, and quietly moves on, already thinking about the next impossible thing that might, eventually, become inevitable. By the time Leonardo da Vinci turns his attention to automation, he has already attempted flight, warfare, and the general defiance of physics. So naturally, the next step is obvious. Create a machine that imitates a human. Not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere in his notes, quietly hidden among anatomical sketches and engineering diagrams, appears a design for what can only be described as a mechanical knight. A suit of armour, hollow on the inside, filled not with a man but with gears, pulleys and cables. It does not breathe. It does not think. But according to Leonardo's design, it can move. The concept is unsettling in the most Renaissance way possible. Inside this armoured figure is a carefully arranged system of ropes and wheels connected to joints at the shoulders, elbows, and legs. When activated, the machine could sit upright, move its arms, even open and close its jaw. Imagine attending a courtly event and watching a knight rise on its own, as if politely ignoring the fact that it has no soul. Subtlety was never really the goal here. Leonardo's obsession with anatomy plays a crucial role. He has spent years studying the human body. Muscles, tendons, the precise mechanics of movement. Where others see flesh, he sees structure. And once you understand structure, replacing it becomes less impossible and more ambitious. Of course, this is not a robot in the modern sense. It does not make decisions or respond to its environment. It follows preset motions, like an elaborate puppet that simply refuses to look like one. Still, for the late 15th century, this is dangerously close to the idea of artificial life. Whether the mechanical knight was ever fully built remains a topic of debate. Some reconstructions, based on Leonardo's surviving notes, suggest that it could have worked, at least well enough to impress, confuse, and mildly disturb anyone watching, which, to be fair, was probably the point. What matters is the idea itself. Leonardo is no longer just designing machines to solve problems or win wars. He is exploring imitation, how to recreate motion, behavior, and perhaps, in some distant thought, life itself. It is a quiet shift, but an important one. The question is no longer, what can machines do, but how close can they get to being us? Centuries later, engineers and scientists will return to that same question, armed with better tools and fewer moral hesitations. And somewhere at the beginning of that long, complicated journey stands a silent, armoured figure, designed by a man who was never entirely satisfied with the limits of his own time. After sketching machines of war, flight, and imitation life, Leonardo da Vinci turns his attention to something far less glamorous, but infinitely more necessary: cities. Specifically, cities that do not slowly poison their inhabitants. The inspiration, as usual, is not entirely pleasant. During his time in Milan, Leonardo witnesses the aftermath of plague outbreaks. Streets crowded, waste piling up, disease spreading with an efficiency that would impress his more destructive inventions. Medieval cities are not designed for hygiene. They are designed for survival, trade, and occasionally not collapsing. Cleanliness is more of a hopeful suggestion than a system. Leonardo, unsurprisingly, finds this unacceptable. So he designs a new kind of city, not one built randomly over centuries, but one planned, structured, layered, and most shocking of all, clean. His ideal city is divided into levels. The upper level is for people, wide streets, open spaces, fresh air moving freely between buildings. The lower level, hidden beneath, is for everything less appealing: sewage, waste, deliveries, and the general unpleasant business of keeping a city alive. In other words, he invents urban planning before it becomes fashionable. Water plays a central role. Leonardo envisions canals running through the city, not just for transport, but for sanitation, constantly moving water to carry away waste, to refresh the environment, to prevent the slow accumulation of decay. Where others see stagnant filth, he sees flow, circulation, and control. It is less a city and more a living system. Naturally, no one builds it. The cost would be enormous. The logistics overwhelming. And convincing an entire society to rebuild itself around hygiene is, historically speaking, a difficult sales pitch. People are very attached to doing things the way they have always done them, even when those things involve questionable smells and recurring plagues. Still, the ideas do not disappear. Centuries later, modern cities will adopt many of these principles: separated infrastructure, sewage systems, planned streets, attention to airflow and density. What seems obvious now was, at the time, almost absurdly forward-thinking. Leonardo was not just trying to improve comfort. He was trying to redesign how humans live together. And once again, he was early, not dramatically wrong, not wildly unrealistic, just inconveniently ahead of a world that had not yet learned that cleanliness, unlike most things, is not optional if you intend to survive your own civilization. By now, it is becoming clear that Leonardo da Vinci does not like limits. Sky, land, even the human body, everything is fair game. So it is only a matter of time before he turns his attention to the one place humans are particularly bad at surviving: underwater. The setting is Venice, a city built on water and perpetually nervous about enemies arriving by sea. Naval warfare here is not a distant concept. It is a constant threat. Ships glide through canals and across the lagoon, carrying trade, power, and occasionally very unfriendly intentions. Leonardo, always eager to improve things in ways that make people slightly uncomfortable, begins designing a way to fight where no one expects it: beneath the surface. His solution is a diving suit. Not the sleek, metal-helmeted version you might imagine, but something far more Renaissance. A suit made of leather, fitted tightly to the body, connected to long-breathing tubes that extend upward to the surface. These tubes are supported by floating devices, essentially primitive air intakes, to ensure the diver does not immediately discover the limits of human lungs. There is even a pouch designed to collect, let's say, biological inconveniences, because Leonardo is nothing if not thorough. The purpose of this suit is not exploration, it is sabotage. Leonardo envisions divers slipping silently beneath enemy ships, unseen and unexpected, cutting through hulls or tampering with structures from below. No dramatic cannon fire, no heroic charges, just quiet, methodical damage delivered from a place no one is watching. It is warfare stripped of spectacle and reduced to pure strategy, which somehow makes it even more unsettling. Of course, the design has its challenges. The materials are fragile. The breathing system is unreliable. The human body, once again, proves annoyingly dependent on stable conditions. Water pressure, limited visibility, and the general discomfort of being submerged for extended periods all conspire against the plan. It is not impossible, but it is far from practical with the tools available at the time, and yet the idea lingers. Centuries later, diving equipment will evolve into something far more advanced, enabling exploration, construction, and, inevitably, more efficient forms of underwater warfare. Submarines, naval divers, covert operations, all of it echoes this early concept sketched in quiet secrecy. Leonardo himself is said to have kept parts of this design hidden, fearing what might happen if such methods became widespread. A rare moment of restraint, perhaps, or simply an understanding that some ideas once released cannot be comfortably returned to paper. Either way, the message is familiar by now. Even the depths were not safe from his imagination. By the end of his life, Leonardo da Vinci leaves behind something far more enduring than any single invention. Not a working machine, not a finished system, but thousands of pages. Quiet, meticulous, and strangely patient. His notebooks are not loud declarations of success. They are whispers, observations, possibilities, ideas waiting for a future that does not yet exist. He writes in reverse, mirror script curling across the pages, as if even his words prefer to move differently from everyone else's. Inside these notebooks, you find everything. Flying machines that never took off. Armoured vehicles that refused to roll. Mechanical figures that almost seemed alive. None of them truly complete. None of them entirely impossible either. That is the unsettling part. Leonardo does not fail in the usual sense. He does not build, test, and watch things collapse in dramatic fashion. Instead, he leaves behind designs that sit in a strange limbo, too advanced for their time, too incomplete to function, yet too accurate to ignore. It is less like failure and more like postponement. And then, history does something curious. It catches up. Centuries pass. Materials improve, knowledge expands, and slowly, one by one, the ideas begin to reappear, not as copies, but as echoes. Machines that fly, vehicles armoured for war, systems designed to move faster, strike harder, or survive longer. Engineers, separated by time but not by curiosity, arrive at conclusions Leonardo had already sketched in silence, not because they studied him directly, but because they followed the same questions. What makes something move? What keeps it stable? What allows it to endure? Leonardo had already asked these questions, relentlessly, obsessively, and written down the answers as best he could. He did not need the future to recognize him. The future simply needed time to understand him. There is something almost ironic about it. A man so far ahead of his era becomes, in a way, invisible within it. His inventions do not reshape his world. They wait quietly until the world is ready to reshape itself. And when it finally does, his presence is still there, subtle, indirect, but undeniable. Not as the builder of the future, but as the one who saw it first, sketched it carefully, and then left it behind, knowing, perhaps, that someone else would eventually finish the work. The door does not swing open with confidence. It hesitates, a slow creak, just enough space to let you slip inside, while quietly announcing your presence to everyone who matters, and more importantly, to those who don't want to be noticed. This is a frontier saloon somewhere in the vast, uncomfortable edge of the American Old West. where the air carries equal parts dust, smoke, and bad decisions. Inside, the light is dim by design. Lanterns hang from wooden beams, their glow uneven, flickering just enough to make every shadow seem alive. You don't see the whole room at once. You discover it in pieces. Boots first, then hands, then faces that take a moment too long to look away. It's not hostility, not exactly. It's evaluation. You've entered the room, and now the room is quietly deciding what to do about it. The piano in the corner is working harder than it should. Each note sounds slightly off, like it has survived more arguments than repairs. The man playing it doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. His job isn't music, it's noise. A steady, predictable layer of sound that keeps conversations private and tensions just below the surface. At the bar, the bartender moves with the calm of someone who has seen everything and chosen not to react. He doesn't ask questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers tend to cause problems. A glass appears in front of you before you fully decide what you want. The drink burns slightly more than expected, which feels appropriate. Around you, conversations happen in fragments. A name mentioned too quietly. A price agreed upon without numbers. A laugh that sounds genuine until it stops too quickly. Nothing here is said directly if it can be implied instead. The less you say, the longer you last. In the far corner, a card game unfolds with unsettling patience. Coins stack in small deliberate towers. Eyes rarely leave the table, except to check the hands of others, or the hands resting suspiciously close to holsters. No one cheats openly. That would be rude. Instead, they cheat carefully, respectfully, like professionals. And through it all, there is a constant feeling, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore. Something could go wrong at any moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, just suddenly. If the door was the warning, the bar is the test. You step closer, and the room adjusts around you. Not visibly, not dramatically. Just enough to remind you that movement here is noticed. The counter is worn smooth by years of elbows, deals, and decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Behind it stands the bartender, a man who has mastered the art of existing without inviting attention. In a place like this, that is not a personality trait. It is a survival skill. He doesn't ask what you want. That would imply choice. Instead, he studies you briefly, your boots, your hands, the way you hold yourself, and places a drink in front of you, as if it had already been decided long before you walked in. The glass is chipped, the liquid inside harsh enough to remind you that comfort is not part of the experience. You take a sip anyway. Everyone does. Refusing a drink here is like refusing to participate in the quiet agreement that keeps things manageable. Around you, the bar acts as the centre of gravity. People drift toward it, linger, then move away, carrying fragments of conversation with them. A man leans in too close to another, speaking in a voice just low enough to stay private. A small pouch changes hands. No one looks directly, but everyone notices. Transactions here are not hidden. They are simply ignored. The bartender notices everything. A glass set down too hard. A pause in conversation that lasts a second too long. The subtle shift of a hand toward a coat or belt. His eyes move constantly, never hurried, never obvious. He doesn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. And when he does, it is quick, decisive, and usually enough to prevent the kind of incident that requires someone to be carried out instead of walking. But even he cannot control everything. At the far end of the counter, two men sit in silence that feels louder than the piano. They are not drinking much. That alone is suspicious. Their attention is fixed, not on each other, but on something unresolved between them. A past disagreement, perhaps. Or a future one waiting for the right moment. The tension builds slowly, like pressure in a sealed room. No one comments. No one interferes. Because in a frontier saloon, the bar is not just where you drink. It's where things begin. If the bar is where things begin, the card table is where they quietly unravel. You notice it without meaning to. A table slightly removed from the rest, positioned just far enough into shadow to feel private, but not so far that it escapes attention. 4 men sit around it, each carrying the calm expression of someone who has already decided not to lose. The problem, of course, is that they can't all be right. Coins are stacked in neat, deliberate towers. No one fidgets. No one rushes. In a place like this, patience is not a virtue, it's a weapon. cards slide across the table with soft, controlled movements, the sound barely louder than breath. Even the piano seems to quiet itself here, as if it understands that this is where the real conversation is happening. You get closer, not too close. That would be a mistake. One of the men, hat low, eyes steady, deals the cards with the kind of precision that suggests long practice and questionable honesty. His hands move smoothly, too smoothly perhaps. Across from him, another player watches not the cards but the hands. That's where the truth usually hides. The others remain still, each pretending not to notice the tension building one careful second at a time. No one talks about the stakes. They don't need to. The coins are only part of it. Reputation sits at the table too. Pride. Old grudges that have been waiting patiently for the right excuse. A single hand can settle something that has been quietly simmering for months. Or make it worse. Much worse. A card is placed down. Then another. A pause follows. Longer than it should be. One of the players exhales slowly, his fingers resting just a moment too long on the edge of the table. Across from him, the dealer's expression doesn't change, which is exactly the problem. Stillness here is rarely innocent. Then it happens. Not an outburst, not yet, but a shift, a glance, sharp, direct. "You sure about that?" one of them asks, his voice calm in the way that suggests it's trying very hard not to be anything else. The room doesn't react. Not openly. But people are listening now, because everyone here understands the same simple truth. At a card table like this, luck is never the only thing in play, and when luck runs out, something else takes its place. If the card table is where tension gathers, the women moving through the room are the ones who understand it first. They drift between tables with practiced ease, dresses brushing against rough wood, voices light, laughter carefully measured. To an outsider, they might seem like part of the background, another detail in a room already full of them. But that would be a mistake. In a frontier saloon, nothing that moves this smoothly is accidental. They hear everything. A whisper exchanged over a glass, a name spoken too quickly, a deal that pretends to be casual but carries far more weight than it should. They do not interrupt. They do not react. They collect. Information in a place like this is worth more than gold, and far easier to hide. One of them leans against the piano, speaking quietly to the man playing. He doesn't stop, but his rhythm shifts slightly, just enough to signal that he's listening. Another passes by the card table, her eyes never dropping to the cards, yet somehow aware of every movement, every hesitation. A hand brushes her arm, briefly, as if by accident. It isn't. A folded note changes hands without anyone officially noticing. You start to understand something uncomfortable. This room does not belong to the loudest people in it. It belongs to those who can move through it without being questioned. Near the bar, one of the women pauses, her attention briefly fixed on the two men who haven't spoken. She says nothing, but her expression tightens just slightly before smoothing out again. Then she moves on, as if nothing happened. But something did. You can feel it. Because she noticed. And if she noticed, others will too. They are not just entertainers. Not really. They are observers, messengers, sometimes even the quiet centre of decisions that men at tables believe they are making themselves. A word passed at the right moment, a warning given just early enough, a secret shared with the correct person, and the entire balance of the room can shift without a single raised voice, and that is the unsettling part. While everyone else watches for threats in plain sight, these women are tracking the ones that haven't revealed themselves yet. Because in a place like this, danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it's already here, moving silently through the room, smiling, listening, and waiting for the exact moment to matter. By now, you've learned how the room works. Who watches, who listens, who pretends not to care. And just when everything settles into that fragile, uneasy balance, the door opens again. This time it doesn't hesitate. It swings wide, louder than necessary, cutting through the piano's rhythm and the quiet murmur of conversation. Every head turns. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that something has changed. The man who steps inside does not belong here. You can tell immediately, not because of what he wears, dust-covered coat, boots that have seen too many miles, but because of how he carries himself. He doesn't scan the room the way newcomers do. He doesn't pause, doesn't adjust, doesn't calculate. He walks in like the outcome has already been decided, and he's simply here to confirm it. That's what makes people uneasy. At the bar, the bartender's hands slow for just a fraction of a second. It's subtle, almost invisible, but in a place built on noticing small things, it's enough. The piano doesn't stop, but the player misses a note. No one comments. They don't need to. The man moves forward, boots echoing slightly against the wooden floor. Too loud, too steady. He doesn't try to blend in, which is either confidence or a complete disregard for consequences. Both are dangerous. Near the card table, one of the players glances up, just briefly. Recognition flickers across his face. Quick, sharp, gone just as fast. His hand tightens on the cards, though he pretends it doesn't. Across from him, the dealer notices. Of course he does. That's his job. The women in the room shift almost imperceptibly, adjusting their paths, their positions. Conversations change direction. Words become fewer, quieter. Information is being recalculated in real time. The man stops at the bar. For a moment he says nothing. Neither does the bartender. They look at each other, not like strangers, but not quite like acquaintances either. Something sits between them, unspoken and heavy with history. Then finally the man speaks. One sentence. Low. Direct. You don't hear the words, but you see the reaction. And it's enough, because whatever he just said doesn't belong in this room either. The tension doesn't explode. Not yet. It tightens, like something being pulled slowly, carefully, just before it snaps. The room does not erupt. That would be too simple. Instead, everything becomes quieter. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, where people relax and lean back. This is the kind that settles in slowly, pressing down on every conversation until words feel unnecessary. The piano keeps playing, but softer now, as if the man in the corner has suddenly remembered that volume can be a liability. At the bar, the stranger still stands, his presence spreading through the room like a rumour no one wants to confirm. Wyatt Earp once said that trouble doesn't announce itself. It arrives, takes a seat, and waits. Whether or not that thought ever passed through his mind in a saloon like this is irrelevant. It feels accurate enough to matter. The bartender sets the glass down in front of the man. No hesitation this time. No questions. The exchange is precise, controlled. But there is something in the way his hand lingers for just a moment too long. A small delay, barely noticeable, but loaded with meaning. The man doesn't drink immediately. Instead, his eyes move, slowly, deliberately, not searching, not scanning, recognizing, one table at a time, one face at a time. He isn't trying to understand the room. He already does. At the card table, the game has stopped pretending to continue. Cards rest untouched. Coins sit where they were, suddenly irrelevant. One of the players shifts in his seat, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound cuts through the room like something sharper than it should be. Across from him, the dealer remains still. Too still. Near the walls, conversations have faded into fragments. People speak just enough to avoid drawing attention to the fact that they're no longer really talking. A laugh starts somewhere, thin and misplaced, then dies quickly when no one joins it. The women who moved so easily before now keep a little more distance, their paths adjusted, their presence quieter but no less aware. One of them pauses near the doorway, not leaving, just positioning herself where she can see everything at once. Because something is about to happen. Not immediately. That would be predictable. No, this kind of moment stretches. It lingers. Every second builds on the last, tightening the air until even breathing feels like participation. The stranger finally reaches for his glass. He takes a sip, sets it down, and somewhere in the room, a decision is made. No one says it out loud, but everyone feels it. The moment does not announce itself. It slips in quietly, like most bad decisions. Somewhere between the stranger setting his glass down and the piano pretending everything is fine, something shifts. Not in the centre of the room, never there. It begins at the edges, in the small, forgettable places where people think no one is looking. At the card table, a hand moves, not toward the cards. Not this time. It drifts, slow and deliberate, toward a coat resting on the back of a chair. The movement is casual enough to be ignored, if you want to ignore it. But in a room like this, nothing is accidental. Not anymore. Across the table, the dealer notices. Of course he does. His eyes don't follow the hand directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, his fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the table, a subtle reaction that says more than words ever could. He doesn't stop the movement. He simply prepares for what it means. Near the bar, the stranger hasn't moved much. He doesn't need to. His presence is doing the work for him. The glass in front of him remains half full, untouched since that last sip, as if he has already lost interest in it. His attention, however, is very much alive. He's waiting. The bartender senses it too. His hands remain steady, but he has stopped pretending to be busy. There's no polishing, no unnecessary movement, just stillness. The kind that suggests he knows exactly how quickly things can go wrong, and how little he can do once they do. Around the room, people begin making quiet adjustments. Chairs shift slightly, angled just enough to allow easier movement. Conversations fade completely now, replaced by silence that feels heavier with each passing second. One of the women moves closer to the wall, her back near the exit, her eyes tracking the room with calm precision. She doesn't panic. Panic is loud. This is something else entirely. The hand at the coat pauses, just for a moment, as if reconsidering, as if hoping, perhaps, that the room might somehow return to what it was a few minutes ago. It won't. Everyone knows that. Once the tension reaches this point, there is no going back. Only forward. Only through. And then, finally, the hand closes around something hidden from view. No one reacts. Not yet. Because the first move in a place like this is never the loud one. It's the one that decides everything that comes after. Once the first move is made, the room doesn't explode. It commits. The hand disappears inside the coat and comes back out again. Not fast, not dramatic, just certain. That's what changes everything. Speed can be mistaken. Certainty cannot. Whatever is being held now isn't meant for show. It's meant for conclusion. No one shouts. No one warns. Because in a frontier saloon, raising your voice is often the least effective way to stay alive. At the card table, chairs scrape back almost in unison, a quiet chorus of wood against floor. The dealer leans away just enough to clear space, his eyes fixed not on the object itself, but on the man holding it. Across from him, another player shifts sideways, calculating angles, distance, timing. Things no one teaches you, but everyone here seems to know. Near the bar, the stranger finally moves. Not quickly. That would suggest urgency, and urgency suggests uncertainty. Instead, he turns slightly, his body angling toward the source of the tension, as if this had always been part of his plan. His hand doesn't rush to his side. It rests there, ready, patient. The bartender steps back. Just one step. It's enough. Around the room, people follow the same silent instruction. They create space, not out of politeness, but out of instinct. Tables become barriers. Shadows become cover. The piano stops mid-note. The silence that follows somehow louder than anything it had been playing. For a moment, everything holds, balanced on something thin and invisible. Then it breaks. Not with chaos, but with precision. Movement happens all at once. Sharp, controlled, unavoidable. The man at the table acts first, or maybe he just acts loudest. The stranger responds. Or perhaps he was already ahead. It's impossible to tell. In moments like this, cause and effect blur together into something faster than thought. A chair overturns. A glass shatters. Someone stumbles back into the wall, knocking a lantern just enough to make the light flicker wildly across the room. And then, just as quickly as it begins, it ends. The silence returns, but it's different now. Heavier, final. No one rushes forward. No one asks questions. Because the room has already decided what happened. And more importantly, what it means. By the time morning arrives, the saloon looks almost ordinary. Sunlight slips through the cracks in the wooden walls, soft and indifferent, as if the night never happened. The lanterns are out. The piano sits quietly in the corner, keys untouched, as if it has decided to forget its role in the tension. Dust floats lazily in the air, replacing the smoke and urgency with something far more peaceful and far more dishonest. Because places like this do not change. They reset. The bartender is already at work. He moves slower now, but not because he's tired. Because there's no need to rush. The room is empty, except for a few early drifters. Men who either didn't see what happened, or have chosen not to remember it. Both types are useful. Both types survive longer than those who ask questions. The tables are back in place. Chairs upright. Broken glass swept into a corner, then quietly removed. If there were marks on the floor, they've been covered. If something was left behind, it's gone now. Frontier saloons have a way of correcting themselves overnight, like nothing more than a bad dream that refuses to leave evidence. No one discusses it. Not directly. A man at the bar mentions the weather. Another complains about the road. Someone laughs at something that isn't particularly funny. Conversations stay light, careful, drifting around the edges of what everyone knows, but no one says. The details of the night have already been reduced to silence, filed away under things better left alone. Even the women move differently now, just slightly, but enough to notice. Their voices are softer, their smiles a little more measured. They carry on as they always do, but with the quiet awareness that the balance of the room has shifted, even if no one acknowledges it. Because something did change. Maybe it was who's no longer here. Maybe it was who is. Either way, the room remembers, even if the people pretend not to. And that's the strange truth about nights in a frontier saloon. They don't end with resolution. They end with continuation. The door will open again tonight. New faces will walk in. The piano will play. The drinks will pour. Deals will be made in whispers. And tension will settle back into its familiar place, waiting patiently for the next moment it's needed. Because nothing here is ever truly finished. It just pauses, long enough for everyone to catch their breath, before it all begins again. In September 1533, inside the royal chambers of Greenwich Palace, a child enters the world surrounded by expectation and quiet disappointment. Her name is Elizabeth I, but in that moment she is not yet the future ruler history will remember. She is, quite inconveniently, not the son her father wanted. That father is Henry VIII, a man who has already reshaped an entire kingdom for the promise of a male heir. He has broken from Rome, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, and married again, all for one purpose: a son to secure the Tudor line. Instead, he is handed a daughter. At first, the disappointment is carefully hidden. Elizabeth is still a princess. She is still acknowledged, celebrated even, in the cautious way royal courts celebrate things that might still become useful. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, stands at the centre of this fragile optimism. As long as Anne holds her position, Elizabeth's future remains intact. But Anne's position is built on something dangerously unstable: favour. And favour at this court does not last. By the time Elizabeth is not yet 3 years old, everything changes. Accusations begin to circle Anne Boleyn. Whispers of betrayal, of infidelity, of crimes that conveniently justify removal. Whether they are true matters less than the outcome. In May 1536, Anne is arrested, tried and executed. The fall is swift. The silence that follows is even faster. And just like that, Elizabeth is no longer a princess. She is declared illegitimate, stripped of status, removed from the line of succession, as if she were a mistake that can be corrected by decree. Her household is reduced. Her future becomes uncertain. The same court that once welcomed her now adjusts around her absence without much difficulty. This is her introduction to power. Unpredictable. Ruthless. Entirely dependent on forces beyond her control. As a child, Elizabeth does not fully understand the politics unfolding around her, but she understands enough. She understands that her mother is gone and not returning. She understands that names and titles can disappear overnight. And most importantly, she begins to understand that survival here does not come from strength alone. It comes from watching, waiting, and never ever being the obvious target. After the fall of Anne Boleyn, the world does not pause to reflect. It simply moves on, efficiently, almost coldly. And in doing so, it leaves Elizabeth I in a strange and uncertain place. She is still the daughter of Henry VIII. That fact cannot be erased. But everything else about her status has changed. Once addressed as princess, she is now referred to with far less enthusiasm. Titles matter at court, and losing one is not a small detail. It is a public reminder of how quickly favour can disappear. Her household is reduced. Servants are dismissed. The small comforts that once surrounded her are quietly taken away. Not with cruelty, but with indifference. That is worse. Cruelty at least acknowledges your presence. Indifference suggests you are no longer worth the effort. She is moved away from the centre of power, sent to live in quieter residences, away from the sharp eyes and sharper ambitions of court life. But distance does not mean safety. It simply means she is no longer the main concern, for now. Her father remarries, then again and again. Each new queen brings new possibilities and new risks. When Jane Seymour arrives, she gives Henry what he has always wanted. A son, Edward VI. The birth of a male heir should make Elizabeth irrelevant, and in many ways it does. But something unexpected happens. Elizabeth is not entirely cast aside. Jane Seymour, unlike her predecessor, shows a degree of kindness toward the young girl. Elizabeth is allowed back into a more stable environment, cautiously welcomed into a royal family that has already proven how easily it can remove its own members. She is no longer central to the future of the kingdom, but she is not erased either. This in-between position becomes her reality, not important enough to be a priority, not unimportant enough to be ignored. And that balance is dangerous, because being too visible invites attention, but being invisible offers no protection either. Elizabeth grows up in this narrow space, learning how to exist without drawing too much focus, how to observe without being observed. Every conversation, every glance, every shift in tone carries meaning. She begins to understand something that many adults at court fail to grasp. Power is not always about holding a crown. Sometimes it is about surviving long enough to be in the room when the crown becomes available. If Elizabeth's childhood has taught her anything so far, it is this: survival does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to the most careful. Removed from the centre of court life, but never fully outside it, Elizabeth I grows up in a strange position, close enough to power to be affected by it, but distant enough to study it. And study it she does. Education becomes her safest weapon. While other children of noble birth are trained in manners and obedience, Elizabeth is quietly building something far more useful. She studies languages: Latin, Greek, French, Italian, absorbing them with unsettling ease. Words, she begins to understand, are not just tools for communication. They are shields. They are disguises. They are ways to say everything, while appearing to say nothing at all. Her tutors quickly realize they are not dealing with an ordinary student. Among them is Roger Ascham, who later writes with a kind of careful admiration about her discipline and intelligence. Elizabeth does not simply learn, she refines. She listens more than she speaks. She answers precisely, never carelessly. Even as a child, she shows a rare ability to control what she reveals, because revealing too much she already knows is dangerous. The court of Henry VIII remains unpredictable. Alliances shift. People rise and fall with alarming speed. A careless word, an unfortunate association, even the wrong expression at the wrong moment. Any of it can lead to consequences that do not end well. Elizabeth adapts. She becomes observant, patient, quiet in the way that unsettles people who expect children to be simple. She learns when to speak, and when silence is the better answer. More importantly, she learns how to appear harmless. That is her greatest advantage. No one sees her as a threat. Not yet. She is still, in many eyes, the daughter of a disgraced queen. A secondary figure, a possibility perhaps, but not an immediate concern. And that allows her something rare in a royal court. Time. Time to learn. Time to understand the rules that are never written down. Time to become something far more dangerous than anyone realizes. Because Elizabeth is not just being educated in books. She is being trained, quietly, unintentionally, by the most ruthless classroom imaginable. A court where survival is not guaranteed, and where those who last the longest are rarely the ones who make the most noise. When Henry VIII dies in 1547, the world does not become safer for Elizabeth I. It simply becomes less predictable. Her half-brother, Edward VI, is now king, but he is still a child. Real power shifts into the hands of those around him, and among them is a man who quickly steps closer than he should. Thomas Seymour. At first, his presence seems almost harmless. Seymour is charming, confident, and ambitious in the way that often looks like friendliness before it becomes something else. He marries Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's stepmother, and moves into a position that places him near the young princess. Close enough to influence, close enough to observe, and then, slowly, the boundaries begin to blur. He visits Elizabeth early in the mornings. Too early. He jokes, he teases, he lingers longer than necessary. What might be dismissed as playful behaviour becomes harder to ignore as it continues. The line between familiarity and impropriety begins to disappear, and in a court already shaped by suspicion, that is not a line anyone should cross. Elizabeth is still a teenager, but she is not unaware. She understands enough to recognise that something is wrong, even if she cannot openly challenge it. Power once again belongs to someone else. Speaking out would not guarantee protection. It might simply create a new problem. For a time, Catherine Parr attempts to manage the situation, sometimes even treating it as something less serious than it is. But tension builds. What begins as uncomfortable becomes dangerous. Not just for Elizabeth, but for anyone connected to her. Eventually, the situation can no longer be ignored. Elizabeth is removed from Seymour's household. Distance is created not out of resolution, but out of necessity. The court, as it often does, chooses containment over confrontation, at least at first. But Thomas Seymour is not a man who steps back easily. His ambitions grow bolder, his actions more reckless, and soon his behaviour extends far beyond inappropriate familiarity into something far more threatening. Political intrigue, power plays, and ultimately open defiance. It ends the way these things often do in Tudor England, with arrest, trial, execution. Elizabeth is questioned, closely, carefully, as authorities attempt to determine how much she knew, how involved she might have been. This is no longer a private matter. It is a potential scandal, one that could destroy her future before it truly begins. And once again, she survives, not by force, not by protest, but by control, careful answers, measured silence, and the growing understanding that in this world, danger rarely announces itself clearly. Sometimes it arrives smiling and stands just a little too close. With Edward VI on the throne, England does not become calmer. It becomes divided. Religion, once controlled firmly by Henry VIII, now shifts rapidly under Edward's rule. Protestant reforms spread aggressively, reshaping churches, traditions, and loyalties. What was once familiar becomes uncertain. And in a country where faith and politics are inseparable, uncertainty is dangerous. For Elizabeth I, this creates a problem she cannot ignore. She is expected to conform, publicly, clearly, without hesitation. Elizabeth adopts Protestant practices, attends services, and presents herself as aligned with the new religious direction of the kingdom. But unlike many around her, she does not rush to extremes. She observes. She adjusts. She remains careful, because she understands something others often forget. Religion at court is not just belief. It is position, and positions can change. Around her, the stakes continue to rise. Nobles choose sides. Alliances form and dissolve. The question of succession lingers in the background, quiet but persistent. Edward is still young, and his health is fragile. Everyone knows it, even if no one says it openly. And Elizabeth's name, whether she likes it or not, begins to matter again. Not loudly, not yet, but enough. She is still technically in the line of succession, still a potential future ruler. And in a court shaped by ambition, potential is enough to attract attention, both supportive and dangerous. Elizabeth responds the only way she knows how. She becomes even more controlled. Her words are measured, her actions deliberate. She avoids unnecessary statements, avoids strong alignments, avoids becoming a symbol for any single faction. Where others declare loyalty, she maintains balance. Where others argue, she listens. It is not indecision, it is survival, because choosing too early, choosing too clearly, could tie her fate to a side that might not win. And in Tudor England, being on the losing side rarely ends well. So she waits. She watches the kingdom reshape itself around her, knowing that every shift brings her closer to something she cannot yet fully control. The throne is not within reach, but it is no longer out of sight either, and that makes her position more dangerous than ever, because now she is not just surviving the court, she is becoming part of its future. By the summer of 1553, the fragile balance holding England together begins to break. Edward VI is dying. He is still young, but illness has reduced him to something quieter, weaker, and increasingly distant from the power that once surrounded him. The court, however, does not slow down out of sympathy. It accelerates. Because when a king is dying, the question is no longer about his rule, but about who comes next. And for Elizabeth I, the answer is dangerously complicated. By law, the succession should pass first to her half-sister, Mary I, and then to Elizabeth herself. It is clear, it is established, it is inconvenient. Mary is Catholic. The men controlling Edward's final days are not. Among them, John Dudley begins to reshape the future with remarkable confidence. If Mary takes the throne, the Protestant reforms of Edward's reign could collapse overnight. That is not a risk they are willing to take. So they do something bold. They attempt to rewrite the succession. Edward, under heavy influence, signs a document excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of inheritance. Instead, the crown is to pass to Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant noblewoman with a claim just strong enough to be useful. Elizabeth watches this unfold from a distance that is anything but safe. She is not directly targeted, but she is not protected either. Her removal from the line is not an attack on her personally. It is a political necessity, and that makes it more dangerous. Personal grudges can be negotiated. Political decisions tend to be final. When Edward dies, the plan is put into motion. Jane Grey is declared queen. For a moment, it almost works. But England is not as easily controlled as the council expects. Support gathers quickly around Mary, whose claim, legal, direct, undeniable, draws strength from both tradition and popular backing. The situation shifts rapidly. What looked like a careful transition begins to unravel. Elizabeth once again does what she has learned to do best. She waits. She does not openly challenge the new regime. She does not openly support it either. She remains still, controlled, observing which way the balance will fall, because choosing wrong now would not mean losing influence. It would mean losing everything. Within days, the outcome becomes clear. Mary triumphs. Jane Grey's reign collapses as quickly as it began, and Elizabeth, once removed, almost erased, finds herself restored to the line of succession once more. But survival here does not bring comfort. It only brings the next challenge, because now the throne belongs to a queen who has every reason not to trust her. With the fall of Lady Jane Grey and the rise of Mary I, the kingdom settles into a new order, one that feels stable on the surface, but carries tension just beneath it. For Elizabeth I, this change is not a relief. It is a test. Mary is now queen, and unlike Edward, she is not a child. She is experienced, determined, and deeply committed to restoring Catholicism in England. Where Edward's reign pushed reform forward, Mary intends to pull it back, firmly, decisively, and without hesitation. That alone creates a problem for Elizabeth. She has publicly aligned herself with Protestant practices, carefully, cautiously, but visibly enough to be noticed. And in Mary's court, religious difference is not just a matter of belief. It is a question of loyalty. At first, Mary treats Elizabeth with restraint. She allows her to remain at court. She does not immediately move against her. There is perhaps a recognition that Elizabeth is still her sister, or at least close enough to be handled carefully. But that restraint is not the same as trust, because Elizabeth represents something dangerous. She is next in line to the throne. She is Protestant, or at least perceived to be, and she is popular. All of that combined makes her a potential rallying point for opposition, whether she intends it or not. In a kingdom already divided by faith, her existence becomes a risk that cannot be ignored. Elizabeth understands this, and once again she adapts. She attends Catholic services. She adjusts her outward behaviour, presenting herself as compliant, respectful, and loyal to the Queen. But her caution is almost too precise, too controlled. It does not erase suspicion. It simply delays it. Meanwhile, tensions across England continue to rise. Not everyone accepts Mary's religious changes. Resistance grows quietly at first, then more openly. And with every sign of unrest, the question returns to the same place. Where does Elizabeth stand? The problem is not what she does. It is what she might represent. Because in a time of uncertainty, people do not just follow leaders. They create them. And whether Elizabeth wants that role or not, she is becoming a symbol, one that Mary cannot fully control, which makes her once again a danger, not because of her actions, but because of what others might do in her name. Suspicion, once planted, does not fade. It grows. By early 1554, that suspicion surrounding Elizabeth I begins to take a more dangerous shape. Rebellion breaks out. Wyatt's rebellion, driven in part by opposition to Mary I and her policies, including her planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Elizabeth does not lead the rebellion. She does not publicly support it, but that does not protect her, because her name appears, whispered, suggested, never fully proven, as a possible figure the rebels might rally behind. And in a court where fear moves faster than evidence, that is enough. Mary cannot ignore it. Orders are given. Elizabeth is arrested. She is taken to the one place that has already defined so many Tudor fates, the Tower of London. The journey itself is heavy with meaning. She enters through the Traitor's Gate, the same passage used for those accused of crimes against the crown. It is not a subtle message. It is a reminder of how close she now stands to the same end her mother once faced. Inside, time slows. Elizabeth is confined, questioned, watched. Every word she has spoken, every letter she has written, every association she has maintained, all of it is examined. Authorities are not just looking for truth. They are looking for proof, something they can use, something final. Elizabeth understands the stakes, and she responds the only way she can. With control, she denies involvement, calmly, consistently. She answers carefully, never offering more than necessary, never contradicting herself. There is no panic, no visible fear, only restraint. It is not defiance. It is precision, because one mistake, one careless word, could end everything. Outside the tower, the situation remains uncertain. The rebellion is crushed. Order is restored. But the question remains unresolved. Is Elizabeth guilty? Mary hesitates. Executing her sister would remove a threat, but it would also create another. Public reaction, political instability, doubt. Killing Elizabeth without undeniable proof could do more damage than letting her live. And so Elizabeth waits. Days pass, then weeks. The tower does not decide her fate. Eventually she is released but not freed. She is placed under house arrest. Still watched, still controlled, still considered dangerous. And yet she has survived again. Not by power, not by support, but by something far more difficult to maintain. Perfect caution. Because in Tudor England, survival is not about proving innocence. It is about avoiding certainty. After the Tower of London, survival becomes quieter, but no less dangerous. Elizabeth I is no longer imprisoned, but she is far from free. Under watch, removed from court, and carefully monitored, she lives in a kind of controlled existence where every letter, every visitor, every word still carries risk. The threat has not disappeared. It has simply become patient. Meanwhile, Mary I rules a kingdom that refuses to stay stable. Her efforts to restore Catholicism grow harsher. Executions increase. Opposition does not vanish, it deepens, and with every passing month, Mary's position becomes more complicated, more fragile than it appears from the outside. And then, slowly, another reality begins to form. Mary has no heir. At first, this is treated as temporary. There are hopes, expectations, even false pregnancies that briefly raise the possibility of a successor. But each time, those hopes collapse, leaving the same question behind. Who comes next? And once again, the answer leads back to Elizabeth. She does nothing to force this outcome. She does not rally supporters. She does not challenge Mary directly. Instead, she does something far more effective. She waits. She remains careful, controlled, outwardly loyal. She attends when required, speaks when necessary, and avoids anything that could justify renewed suspicion. The same discipline that kept her alive now begins to shape something else. Credibility. Because unlike others, she is not rushed. She has not failed. She has simply endured. By 1558, Mary's health declines. The tension that once surrounded Elizabeth begins to shift. Not disappearing, but changing direction. She is no longer just a threat. She is the inevitable successor. When Mary dies in November, the transition happens with surprising clarity. Elizabeth becomes queen, not through force, not through rebellion, but through survival. Everything she has endured, her mother's execution, her loss of status, suspicion, interrogation, imprisonment, all of it has shaped her into something uniquely prepared for this moment. She has learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act, and when to wait. And now the waiting is over. The girl once declared illegitimate, once imprisoned as a potential traitor, now sits on the throne of England, not because she was chosen early, but because she was the one who lasted long enough to be chosen at all.